My mother-in-law told my friends she saw me brazenly cheating in public and that I was clearly not loyal to her son. When I asked her why she'd make that up, she smirked and said, "Because I know people like you. Sooner or later, the truth comes out." I stayed silent. That was 9 months ago. This morning, she was led out of her house in handcuffs, screaming that we'd framed her. My mother-in-law spread rumors that I was cheating and tarnished my reputation, so I revealed her gambling debts at the family reunion. From the moment I married into my husband's family, my mother-in-law made it clear she didn't like me. She didn't even try to hide it. At our first holiday dinner, she made a toast to my son, who could have done so much better, but we support him anyway. Everyone laughed awkwardly, and she just smiled like she'd made the funniest joke. That set the tone for the years that followed. She'd make little digs constantly. If I cooked, she'd wrinkle her nose and say, "I'm sure it tastes better than it looks." If I bought new clothes, she'd smirk, trying to look expensive on a budget? At first, I thought maybe she didn't realize how hurtful she was being. Nope, she knew exactly what she was doing. Once, at a family barbecue, she told everyone I was a gold digger who married for stability. She said it in front of distant relatives I had just met. When I confronted her privately, she laughed and said, "Oh, relax. If it wasn't true, you wouldn't be so defensive." That's her style. Say something cruel, then act like I'm crazy for reacting. She also liked to play games with my relationship. She'd text my husband articles about warning signs your spouse is using you and underline parts about financial motives. She'd accidentally call him by his ex's name in front of me. And whenever we had even the smallest disagreement, she'd tell him, "You know, my door's always open if you want to come back home." The worst was when I had a miscarriage 2 years ago. She actually said to my face, "Maybe it's for the best. Some people just aren't meant to be mothers." I had to leave the room before I said something I couldn't take back. My husband told her she crossed the line, but she just rolled her eyes and muttered, "You both are too sensitive." Fast forward to a few months ago. Everything seemed calm, too calm. Then I started getting weird stares from some of my friends. A couple stopped answering my texts. Finally, one friend pulled me aside and said, "Look, I don't know if it's true, but your mother-in-law told everyone she saw you kissing another man at the mall." I was floored. I hadn't even been to the mall in months. She had made up an entire story about how I was brazenly cheating in public and clearly not loyal to her son. And she didn't just tell 1 or 2 people. She told the entire extended family, church members, and even my husband's boss's wife. She wanted to destroy my reputation. When I confronted her, she didn't deny it. She smirked and said, "Well, if it's not true, then you have nothing to worry about, right?" I asked her why she'd make something like that up, and she replied, "Because I know people like you. Sooner or later, the truth comes out." That was the last straw. I'd kept quiet through years of insults, snide remarks, and manipulations. But this was intentional character assassination, and I knew exactly how to handle it. See, my mother-in-law has a little problem, gambling. And by little, I mean she has racked up thousands in debt at local casinos. I knew because a few years ago, she asked my husband to borrow money to cover what she called a temporary shortage. I later found the actual collection letters in her purse when she asked me to grab her wallet. She was terrified of anyone finding out. She maintained this perfect image of being a responsible, respected woman in the community, so I decided to let the truth speak for itself. At the next big family gathering, her birthday dinner, no less, she made another sly comment about trust and loyalty in marriage. I smiled sweetly, pulled out my phone, and connected it to the TV to display some family photos. The first few were harmless. Then click, a screenshot of an overdue notice from the casino, with her name and the amount in bold red letters. The room went dead silent. I said, "Since we're talking about trust, maybe we should also talk about the $48,000 in gambling debts you've been hiding from your husband and everyone else here." Gasps all around. She tried to stammer something about it being fake, but I had multiple notices, including ones addressed to her home. Her husband, my father-in-law, looked like someone had slapped him. He had no idea. Other relatives started whispering. She turned red and then pale. Finally, she stood up and stormed out, but not before hissing at me, "You'll regret this." The room stayed quiet for what felt like forever after she left. Robert stood there staring at the doorway she'd gone through, his hands shaking as he picked up one of the printed notices I'd left on the table. His face went from confused to angry to just completely lost as he read through the amounts and dates. Family members started whispering to each other and pulling out their phones, probably Googling the casino names on the documents. Daniel's cousin grabbed another paper and whistled low when he saw the numbers. Robert finally sat down hard in his chair and put his head in his hands, while people around us started asking questions all at once. I gathered up the rest of the papers and handed them to Robert without saying anything else. We left about 10 minutes later with nobody really knowing what to say. The car ride home was dead silent, except for Daniel's breathing getting heavier every few minutes. When we got home, he went straight to the guest bedroom and shut the door. I heard him on the phone with his dad for over 2 hours that night. The next morning, Robert showed up at our door with red eyes and asked if he could look at all the documents I had. I gave him copies of everything, including some credit card statements I'd found that Sharon had hidden in a shoebox in their closet months ago when I was helping her look for something. He sat at our kitchen table going through each one, making notes in a little notebook. Daniel came out of the guest room long enough to make coffee, but went right back in without talking to either of us. 3 days later, Marcus called me at work. He'd been helping Robert sort through their finances since Robert didn't understand half of what he was looking at. Marcus told me it was way worse than the $48,000 we'd seen. There were 3 credit cards maxed out in both their names that Robert never knew existed. Sharon had forged his signature on all the applications. Marcus said Robert was talking to a divorce lawyer that afternoon. After I hung up, I found Daniel in the garage when I got home, sitting on the floor with a bunch of old photo albums spread around him. He showed me a picture of Sharon teaching him to ride a bike when he was maybe 6 years old. She looked so different then, actually happy and not fake smiling like she always did now. Daniel kept flipping through pages and pointing at different pictures, trying to figure out when everything went wrong. He couldn't finish most of his sentences and just kept shaking his head. I sat with him for a while but didn't know what to say. 2 days after that, I was eating lunch at my desk when the receptionist called saying someone was in the lobby demanding to see me. I walked out to find Sharon screaming at the security guard that she needed to talk to me right now. Everyone in the lobby was staring, and my coworkers started coming out of the conference room to see what was happening. Sharon saw me and started yelling that I'd destroyed her family, that I was a manipulative liar who preyed on good families. Security was already moving toward her, but she kept screaming about how everyone needed to know what kind kind of person I really was. She tried to push past the guard to get to me, but he blocked her while calling for backup. Another guard showed up and they escorted her out while she kept yelling threats. My boss Janet pulled me into her office right after and asked if I was okay. She had me sit down and explain everything that had been happening with Sharon for the past few months. I told her about the cheating rumors, the birthday dinner confrontation, and now this. Janet's face got more serious with each thing I described. She said the company took workplace safety very seriously, and they'd be filing a no trespass order immediately. She also said I should document everything and consider getting a restraining order myself. That evening, Daniel and I ate Chinese takeout in silence, both of us completely worn out from everything. When I opened my fortune cookie, it said something about truth having many faces. Daniel read it, crumpled it up, and threw it in the trash. He said he was moving back to our bedroom that night because we needed to face this together or we wouldn't make it at all. It was the first time he'd slept in our bed since the birthday dinner. Sunday morning, we went to church like usual, trying to act normal. After the service, Pastor Gregory pulled us aside near the parking lot. He said he'd been having concerning conversations all week with different church members. Sharon had been calling people on the prayer chain, asking them to pray for Daniel's marriage to survive his wife's infidelity. She'd even sent an email to the entire church directory with her version of events, claiming I was having multiple affairs and she was just trying to protect her son. Pastor Gregory handed us a printed copy of the email, which was 3 pages long and completely made up. The subject line said, "Urgent prayer request for my son's marriage," and she'd sent it to over 200 people. We were still dealing with that mess when Robert showed up at our door the next day carrying a cardboard box. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days. He told us he'd been staying at the Comfort Inn since the birthday dinner because he couldn't stand being in the same house where Sharon had lied to him for so long. The box was full of receipts from casinos going back 8 years, way before Daniel and I even met. Robert had found them hidden in the attic behind Christmas decorations. Daniel helped his dad carry in 3 more boxes of financial documents Sharon had hidden all over their house. Robert said every time he thought he'd found everything, he'd discover another hiding spot with more evidence of her gambling. A week went by with Sharon calling and texting everyone in the family with different versions of her story. Claire organized a small get-together at her apartment with some of my friends who'd heard Sharon's rumors over the past months. Rachel, who I'd known since college, admitted they should have told me sooner what Sharon was saying. Apparently, Sharon had approached each of them separately over the past 6 months, swearing them to secrecy and saying she was concerned about me. She'd told each friend a slightly different story to see which version would spread. They spent 2 hours putting together a timeline on Claire's laptop of when Sharon had contacted each of them and what specific lies she'd told. The rumor campaign had started 6 months ago, right after Daniel got his promotion at work. That evening, I found Robert sitting alone in our backyard, just staring at his wedding ring as the sun went down. He'd been staying in our guest room for the past few days because the hotel was getting expensive. He kept turning the ring around on his finger and told me he didn't know who he'd been married to for 35 years. The woman he fell in love with wouldn't have done any of this. I sat next to him on the bench and we just watched the sunset without talking. Sometimes there wasn't anything to say. The next morning, a courier showed up with an envelope from a law firm. Sharon had hired a lawyer and was sending us a cease and desist letter claiming defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Daniel read through it at the kitchen table, his face getting redder with each page. She was demanding $50,000 in damages, which was almost exactly what she owed in gambling debts. The letter also threatened criminal charges for theft of private financial documents if we didn't pay up and publicly apologize for humiliating her. Daniel called 3 lawyers that afternoon, and the first 2 wouldn't even take an appointment once they heard it was a family dispute with his mother. The third one, Patricia Hoffman, had an opening the next morning and charged $300 just for the consultation. We sat in her office while she read through Sharon's cease and desist letter, making notes on a yellow pad and occasionally raising her eyebrows. She explained that while the letter was mostly legal posturing meant to scare us, Sharon could drag this out and make it expensive if she wanted to be vindictive. Patricia told us to document everything from now on, every text, every email, every witness to any interaction, because this could get ugly fast. 3 days later, Daniel came home from work with his hands shaking and his face white. His boss had pulled him into a conference room to tell him that Sharon had been calling the office expressing concern about Daniel's mental state since marrying me. The boss said he didn't want to get involved in family drama, but the calls were becoming disruptive to the workplace. Daniel forwarded me the email his boss sent documenting the conversation, and I could see his hands trembling as he typed. That same week, Linda texted me asking to meet privately at a coffee shop downtown. She slid a piece of paper across the table with names and dollar amounts written in her neat handwriting. Sharon had been borrowing money from other relatives too, thousands from each one with different sob stories. Linda said they were planning an intervention, but Sharon was so manipulative she'd already convinced their Aunt Dorothy that I was the reason she started gambling in the first place, that she needed it to cope with the stress of having me in the family. I couldn't sleep after that meeting. At 3 in the morning, I lay there listening to Daniel toss and turn beside me while every little sound made me jump. A car door slamming down the street had me checking the security camera app on my phone, staring at the empty driveway and wondering if Sharon was out there somewhere watching us. The stress was eating at both of us, and I could see it in the dark circles under Daniel's eyes and the way he flinched every time his phone rang. 2 weeks went by before Sharon made her next move. We were eating dinner when the doorbell rang and 2 police officers stood on our porch. They asked if they could come in to discuss an alleged theft that had been reported. Daniel's face went completely pale as they explained Sharon had filed a report claiming I stole financial documents from her home. I told them exactly what happened, how she'd asked me to grab her wallet from her purse 2 years ago, and I'd seen the collection letters then. The officers took notes and exchanged glances with each other, and I could tell they thought Sharon's story didn't add up, but they still had to investigate. After they left, we thought that would be the end of it, but 2 weeks later, our bank called. Our joint checking account had been frozen because Sharon had somehow filed a fraudulent claim saying we'd stolen money from her. The bank manager apologetically explained it would take weeks to resolve, and she needed an official police report clearing us of the theft charges before she could unfreeze our funds. Daniel had to take a loan from his 401k just to pay our mortgage that month. Pastor called us the following Sunday asking us to come to an emergency emergency meeting with Sharon at the church. She showed up playing the perfect victim, dabbing at her eyes with tissues and sobbing about how she just wanted her family back. She told Pastor that I had turned everyone against her with lies and exaggerations. When Pastor brought up the $48,000 in gambling debts, she claimed I was blowing a few harmless lottery tickets out of proportion. Daniel sat there watching his mother lie to their pastor's face. His jaw clenched so tight I thought he might crack a tooth. After the meeting, Daniel completely lost it in the parking lot. He screamed about how she'd looked Pastor right in the eye and lied about everything. Then he punched the side of our car so hard he left a dent and split his knuckles open. I wrapped his hand in napkins from the glove box while he ranted about his whole childhood being built on lies. Every lecture about honesty coming from someone who'd been deceiving everyone for years. The next week, Robert showed up at our door with legal papers in his hand. He'd filed for divorce and had Sharon served at her book club meeting in front of all her friends. Within an hour, she was calling Daniel's phone hysterical, screaming that Robert was abandoning her because of my vendetta against her. Daniel put her on speaker, and we listened to her spiral through blaming me, threatening to hurt herself, and claiming she'd have nothing to live for if Robert left. She called 17 times that night until Daniel finally blocked her number. Monday morning, I walked into work to find my desk covered in printed emails. Sharon had found my coworkers' personal email addresses on social media and sent them all messages about my supposed mental instability and pathological lying. Each email was different, but they all painted me as dangerous and unstable. My supervisor, Janet, found me in the bathroom trying not to have a panic attack. Janet helped me clean myself up while the IT department worked on tracking how Sharon had gotten everyone's personal information. Claire showed up at my office an hour later with a stack of folders and started organizing every single text, email, and voicemail Sharon had sent us over the past 4 months. She printed screenshots, made copies, dated everything, and put sticky notes on the most threatening messages. The binder grew thicker by the hour as we added phone records, witness statements from co-workers who'd received the emails, and documentation from my supervisor about the work disruption. Claire kept saying this was exactly what she'd done when her ex-husband had stalked her after their divorce. 2 days later, Daniel called me from his car outside his office building, and his voice was shaking. Sharon had shown up at his workplace that morning and told security that her son was having a mental health crisis and had been talking about hurting himself. Security had immediately called HR, and within minutes, Daniel was being escorted to a conference room where 2 managers and a counselor were waiting. They made him answer questions about his mental state, asked if he had access to weapons, and told him he couldn't return to his regular duties until he completed a full psychological evaluation. His co-workers had watched him being led away, and now everyone was treating him like he might snap at any moment. The evaluation took 3 days and cost us $800 that insurance wouldn't cover. While Daniel was dealing with that humiliation, Marcus was helping Robert sort through financial documents for the divorce when he found something that made him call us immediately. Sharon had opened 3 credit cards in Daniel's name when he was 19 and in college, running up $12,000 in debt that she'd been making minimum payments on for years. Marcus pulled Daniel's credit report and found 2 more cards, plus a personal loan for $5,000 that Daniel had never known about. The signatures on the applications were clearly forged, and Marcus said this was federal identity theft that could send Sharon to prison. We met Sharon and her lawyer at his office the next week with all the evidence Marcus had found. Sharon didn't even try to deny it when we showed her the forged signatures and fraudulent applications. She actually smiled and said she'd been helping Daniel build credit history, and that everything she'd ever done was for her family. Her lawyer kept shifting in his seat as Sharon went on a 20-minute rant about ungrateful children and manipulative daughters-in-law who turned sons against their mothers. The lawyer finally interrupted her and suggested maybe they should discuss a settlement. That night, Daniel sat in his childhood bedroom at Robert's house going through boxes of old bank statements and canceled checks. He found loan applications from when he was barely out of high school with signatures that weren't his, credit inquiries he'd never authorized, and even a car loan in his name for a vehicle he'd never owned. His hands were shaking as he showed me each document, and when he found a life insurance policy she'd taken out on him without his knowledge, he finally broke down completely. I held him for an hour while he sobbed about the mother he thought he'd had versus the criminal who'd stolen his identity for years. Sunday at church was supposed to be a break from the chaos, but after service, several members pulled us aside in the fellowship hall. Mrs. Patterson, who'd known Sharon for 20 years, showed us a notebook where she'd been tracking money she'd loaned Sharon over the past 2 years. $20 here, $50 there, always with stories about car repairs or medical bills or helping a sick relative. The other church members had similar stories, and when they compared notes, they'd documented over $3,000 in loans that Sharon had never repaid. They'd been too embarrassed to say anything before, but after hearing about the gambling debts at her birthday dinner, they realized they'd all been scammed. Monday morning, a social worker showed up at our door with a clipboard and an apologetic expression. Sharon had called Child Protective Services claiming we were unfit to have children because of my supposed mental instability and Daniel's suicidal tendencies that she'd fabricated at his workplace. The social worker spent 10 minutes looking around our clean house, reviewing the false reports Sharon had made and checking our references before closing the case. She warned us that Sharon could call again and suggested we document everything for potential harassment charges. Linda called that afternoon with information she'd been hiding for years. Sharon had been attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings in the next town over, but never lasted more than 3 sessions before quitting. She'd been going on and off for 2 years, always making excuses about why the program didn't work for her. Linda said Sharon had told her once that gambling was the only thing that made her feel truly alive, that the rush of placing a bet was better than any drug. She'd tried to get Sharon into treatment multiple times, but Sharon always insisted she could control it on her own. A month later, our mortgage company called about suspicious activity on our account. Someone claiming to be me had been calling repeatedly trying to add Sharon as a co-signer on our home loan. The fraud department had caught it when the caller couldn't answer security questions correctly, but their investigation revealed Sharon had been attempting identity theft against us for weeks. She'd tried to access our bank accounts, applied for credit cards in my name, and even attempted to transfer utilities into her name at our address. The investigator said this showed a pattern of escalating criminal behavior that was likely to continue. That night, I woke up at 4 in the morning to find Daniel's side of the bed empty. I found him in the dark living room with his laptop open to a folder labeled evidence that contained hundreds of files. He'd organized everything into categories: financial fraud, identity theft, harassment, defamation, forgery, and criminal impersonation. Each subfolder had documents, recordings, witness statements, and legal proof of Sharon's crimes spanning over a decade. He looked up at me with hollow eyes and said he could destroy her with all of this, could send her to prison for years, but she was still his mother, and he didn't know if he could do it. I watched him close the folder and put his head in his hands, and that's when I knew we needed help beyond what we could handle ourselves. Claire had mentioned her cousin worked with a private investigator for her divorce, so I called her that night and got the number. The investigator was this older guy who'd seen it all, and when we explained the situation, he just nodded like he'd heard this story 100 times before. Within a week, he had everything we needed and more. He'd followed Sharon to 3 different casinos in Cedar Rapids and the surrounding area, taking photos of her at the slot machines for hours at a time. The pictures were all date and time stamped, showing her there almost every single day, always alone, always for at least 4 or 5 hours. She'd told Robert she was at book club, volunteering at the hospital, visiting friends, but the photos proved she was lying about everything. The investigator said she was there from opening to closing some days, barely eating, just feeding money into those machines like her life depended on it. Meanwhile, Robert had finally had enough and hired his own divorce lawyer, and that's when things got really bad. The lawyer subpoenaed the casino records, and what came back made everyone sick. Sharon had lost over $200,000 in the past decade, money that was supposed to be their retirement savings. Robert broke down right there in the lawyer's office when he saw the numbers. He kept saying they'd refinanced the house 3 times because Sharon said they needed money for home improvements, for medical bills, for helping family members, but it all went to the casinos. The house they'd lived in for 30 years was now underwater on its mortgage, and they were both in their 60s with no retirement left. Pastor Wells showed up at our door a few days later, looking exhausted and defeated. He sat at our kitchen table and admitted Sharon was beyond his help, that he'd been trying to counsel her, but she showed all the signs of narcissistic personality disorder mixed with gambling addiction. He said she genuinely believed she was the victim in all of this, that we'd somehow forced her into this situation. He offered to write a statement about how she'd been using the church to spread lies about me, how she'd turned prayer groups into gossip sessions, how she'd manipulated church members against us. Then everything exploded when Sharon got caught on the church security camera, stealing money from the offering plate during Wednesday night service. The church treasurer had noticed discrepancies for months, but never suspected Sharon because of her reputation. Pastor Wells had no choice but to ban her from the church and report it to the police, and within hours, everyone in Cedar Rapids knew about it. The news spread through our small community like wildfire, and suddenly all those people who'd believed her lies about me were calling to apologize, saying they should have known something was wrong. 2 weeks later, Linda called to tell us about the family intervention they'd tried to hold without us. She said it was a complete disaster, that Sharon had screamed and blamed everything on Daniel and me, saying we drove her to steal, we drove her to gamble, we destroyed her life. Half the family still believed her and stormed out in solidarity, while the other half finally saw her for what she was, and now the entire extended family was split down the middle. Some relatives we'd known for years wouldn't even speak to us anymore, while others were calling to say they'd suspected something was wrong with Sharon for years, but never had proof. The district attorney's office contacted us the next week, saying they were building a case against Sharon for identity theft, fraud, and theft from a religious organization. The ADA explained that with our evidence and testimony, they could prosecute, but they needed us to cooperate fully. Daniel struggled with the decision for days, barely sleeping, barely eating, but finally he looked at me and said she'd made her choices, and now she had to face the consequences. Our bank finally unfroze our accounts after a month-long investigation cleared us of all Sharon's fraudulent claims, and the bank manager apologized over and over, explaining that Sharon was now flagged in their system for attempted fraud. She told us Sharon wouldn't be able to open accounts or make claims at any affiliated banks in the entire state, that her financial reputation was completely destroyed. That night at 2 in the morning, Sharon left a voicemail on Daniel's phone, her voice slurred from drinking, saying I'd won, asking if I was happy now that her husband had left her church had abandoned her own son had betrayed her. Daniel deleted it without responding, but neither of us could sleep after hearing the venom in her voice, the way she still refused to take any responsibility. The next morning, the police showed up at Sharon's house to arrest her for theft from the church and identity theft. The neighbors all came out to watch as she was led away in handcuffs, screaming that we'd framed her, that this was all a conspiracy, that she was innocent. The local news picked up the story immediately with a headline about a prominent community member arrested for theft and fraud, and our phones didn't stop ringing with reporters wanting statements, wanting to know the whole story. Claire organized a support group meeting at her house that weekend, inviting anyone who'd been hurt by Sharon's schemes over the years. 12 people showed up, and as they shared their stories, a pattern emerged that made us all sick. There were loans never repaid, lies told to destroy friendships, manipulation tactics to control family members, financial schemes going back 20 years. One woman started crying when she realized Sharon had been doing this for decades, and they'd all been too embarrassed or afraid to speak up, thinking they were the only ones, thinking no one would believe them because Sharon had such a good reputation in the community. A week after Sharon got arrested, she somehow posted bail using money from some distant cousin who didn't know the whole story. The very next day, our security cameras caught her driving past our house 3 times in 1 hour. She'd slow down right in front, stare at our windows, then speed off when she saw the cameras. I downloaded the footage and sent it straight to the prosecutor's office. They called back within an hour saying they'd file violation charges immediately. 2 days later, Daniel's phone rang while we were eating breakfast. It was Sharon's lawyer saying she wanted to make a deal. She'd drop all her civil claims against us and sign a permanent no-contact order if we didn't testify at her criminal trial. The lawyer kept saying she was looking at serious prison time. Daniel put him on speaker and told him she should have thought about that before breaking the law. The lawyer tried to argue, but Daniel hung up on him. That same week, Robert called to say he'd moved into a small studio apartment across town. We went to see him and the place was tiny, just 1 room with a kitchenette and a bathroom. He'd sold most of his tools and cashed out his pension early just to afford the security deposit. Over Chinese takeout on his folding table, he told us he'd joined a support group for people whose spouses had gambling problems. problems. He looked older, more tired, but also somehow lighter. 3 weeks later came Sharon's preliminary hearing at the courthouse. The prosecutor laid out all the charges while Sharon sat there in her orange jumpsuit. 18 counts of identity theft from opening credit cards in other people's names. 12 counts of fraud for the fake loan applications. 3 counts of regular theft for money she'd taken from Robert's retirement account without permission. Her lawyer asked for reduced bail, but the judge looked at the evidence of her driving past our house. The judge called her a danger to the victims and ordered her back to jail until trial. Sharon started yelling that we'd set her up, but the bailiffs dragged her out. A month later, our house felt weird and quiet for the first time in forever. Daniel and I could eat dinner without checking our phones every 5 minutes. We didn't jump when cars drove by anymore. We could actually relax on our own couch without worrying about surprise visits or angry phone calls. Daniel said he'd forgotten what normal felt like, but we both knew the trial was coming in a few months and things would get crazy again. The prosecutor's office called us in every week to go over evidence and practice our testimony. The assistant district attorney warned us that Sharon's lawyer would try to make us look vindictive. She told us to stay calm and stick to facts no matter what they said. The trial date got set for 3 months out. Meanwhile, Sharon's lawyer kept filing motion after motion trying to get evidence thrown out. He claimed we'd illegally recorded her, stolen her documents, violated her privacy. The judge dismissed almost all of them at the next hearing. He said Sharon's criminal behavior meant she couldn't expect privacy about those financial documents. Sharon sat there turning red, then white, then red again. 6 weeks before the trial, the support group for Sharon's victims had grown to 20 people. We all met at the community center every Tuesday night. Marcus helped us put together a timeline showing Sharon's schemes going back 15 years. We calculated she'd stolen or scammed over $300,000 from family, friends, and banks. Some people had lost their homes because of her. Others had their credit destroyed. Daniel started seeing a therapist to deal with everything that happened with his mom. After one session, he came out to the parking lot where I was waiting and just broke down crying. He said he was grieving someone who never really existed. The mother he thought he had was just another one of her acts. I held him while he sobbed in my arms. 2 weeks before trial, Sharon started calling relatives from jail trying to spread new lies about us. She told Daniel's aunt that I was pregnant with another man's baby. She told cousins that Daniel was planning to have her killed in prison. The family group chat blew up with people asking if it was true. Then Linda posted recordings of the actual phone calls she'd gotten from Sharon. You could hear Sharon's voice clear as day making up these crazy stories. People finally started to see who she really was. That same night, my phone buzzed with a Facebook message from someone named Carol. She'd seen Linda's posts about Sharon and said she went to college with her back in the 80s. Carol sent me old documents from their dorm showing Sharon got kicked out for stealing money from other students and cheating on tests. The college paperwork had Sharon's name all over it with words like expelled and academic dishonesty stamped in red. Carol said Sharon did the same stuff back then, lying about people and taking their things, and she'd kept these papers for 40 years because Sharon had ruined her roommate's life with false accusations. I forwarded everything to our lawyer, who added it to our growing pile of evidence against Sharon. 3 weeks passed before the pretrial hearing at the courthouse downtown. Sharon walked in wearing an orange jumpsuit and immediately stood up to tell the judge she was firing her court-appointed lawyer. The judge leaned forward and told her that wasn't a good idea, but Sharon kept insisting nobody understood her case except her. The prosecutor actually smiled when the judge finally agreed to let Sharon represent herself. I watched Sharon shuffle papers around trying to look like she knew what she was doing, while the prosecutor organized his files with practiced ease. 2 days after that disaster, Pastor called to say he was holding a special service for everyone Sharon had hurt over the years. About 30 people showed up to the church that Sunday afternoon. Some I'd never even met before. They went around the room sharing stories about Sharon's lies and schemes going back decades. One woman said Sharon had gotten her fired from her job by spreading rumors 20 years ago. Another man said Sharon had borrowed $5,000 from him and never paid it back. Pastor stood at the front and told us evil grows in silence, but speaking truth breaks its power. People were crying and hugging each other like they'd been carrying these wounds for years. While all this was happening, Sharon was busy in jail writing a lawsuit against me, Daniel, Robert, the church, and even the prosecutor. The guard delivered the handwritten papers to our house 3 days later, claiming we were all part of a conspiracy to commit elder abuse. Our lawyer Patricia looked at the messy writing and actually laughed out loud. She said this was perfect because it showed Sharon's pattern of using lawsuits to harass people when she didn't get her way. We still had to file a legal response, which cost us another $1,000 we didn't have. A month before the trial was supposed to start, I was shopping for groceries when I saw a woman with the same gray hair as Sharon reaching for bread. My chest got tight and I couldn't breathe, so I ran to the car where Daniel found me 20 minutes later gasping for air. He held my hands and kept saying she was locked up and couldn't hurt us anymore, but my body wouldn't stop shaking. The panic attacks started happening more often after that, sometimes just from hearing a voice that sounded like hers. Meanwhile, the private investigator Robert hired finally found what Sharon had been hiding all along. She'd been seeing another man for 5 years, someone she met at the casino who thought she was getting divorced. The investigator had photos of them together at hotels and copies of money transfers where Sharon sent him thousands of dollars from the accounts she shared with Robert. When Robert saw the evidence, his face went white, then red, then he just sat there staring at the photos for a long time. He said at least he knew he wasn't crazy because he'd always felt something was wrong, but Sharon made him think he was imagining things. The prosecutor called us a week later to say he'd offered Sharon a deal where she'd serve 2 to 3 years if she admitted guilt to the lesser charges and paid back the money she stole. Sharon turned it down flat and told him she'd convinced the jury she was the real victim here. The assistant district attorney said Sharon actually believed her own lies, which meant the trial would be ugly because she'd fight like a cornered animal. 2 days before we were supposed to start jury selection, the jail called to say Sharon had hoarded her medication and taken it all at once. They found her unconscious in her cell and rushed her to the hospital where they pumped her stomach and put her on suicide watch. The trial got pushed back while doctors did a psychological evaluation to see if she was mentally fit to stand trial. Daniel sat on our couch that night and said something that shocked me. He said part of him wished she'd succeeded because then this would all be over. He asked if that made him a monster and I didn't know what to say because I'd been thinking the same thing. The psychiatrist's report came back saying Sharon had something called narcissistic personality disorder, with antisocial features, plus her gambling addiction. The doctor wrote that Sharon showed no real remorse for anything she'd done, just anger that she got caught. They said she was competent to stand trial even with the diagnosis, which meant we'd have to go through with everything. Because of jail overcrowding and her suicide attempt, the judge agreed to let Sharon out on house arrest with an ankle monitor 2 months after the trial got postponed. She was supposed to stay at her sister's house and not leave except for medical appointments. Within 3 hours of getting home, she cut off the ankle monitor with kitchen scissors and disappeared. The police issued a warrant immediately and started searching for her. That night, Daniel's phone rang and we heard Sharon's voice on the voicemail saying we did this to her and we'd pay for destroying her life. The police went to Sharon's house the next morning to search for clues about where she might have gone. They found way more than they expected. In her bedroom closet behind a fake panel, they discovered stacks of journals going back 20 years. The detective called us while they were still there, and his voice sounded shocked. These weren't normal diaries, but detailed records of every scheme and con she'd pulled on people. There was an entry from our wedding day that made my blood run cold when he read it to me. She'd written that I would regret joining the family and she'd make sure of it. The detective said in 30 years of police work, he'd never seen such extensive documentation of deliberate manipulation. They found lists of people she'd borrowed money from with notes about their weaknesses. There were pages about how to guilt Robert into giving her cash for her gambling. She'd even documented fake illnesses she'd used to get sympathy and money from church members. 2 nights later at 2 a.m., our security system started screaming and woke us from a dead sleep. Daniel grabbed the baseball bat while I called 911 and watched the camera feed on my phone. Someone had been in our backyard but was already gone when police arrived 3 minutes later. They found our fence wires cut clean through with some kind of tool. Then they found something that made my hands shake so bad I dropped my phone. A kitchen knife from Sharon's house was stabbed deep into our back door with a note wrapped around it. The note said we couldn't hide from a mother's love, and I knew she'd been right there while we slept. The FBI got involved the next day because Sharon had crossed state lines and had this long history of fraud. Agent Martinez came to our house and interviewed us for 3 hours about everything. She told us Sharon had escalated from financial crimes to potential violence, and they were treating this as high priority. They put our house under surveillance with agents watching 24/7 in unmarked cars. Then Sharon's casino boyfriend Tony called the police from Chicago with something huge. She'd shown up at his apartment demanding money, and when he refused, she went crazy threatening him. But Tony was smart and had recorded the whole thing on his phone without her knowing. In the recording, we could hear Sharon saying she was going to destroy everyone who betrayed her, starting with me. She said she had nothing left to lose and would make us all pay for ruining her life. The FBI said this recording was crucial evidence of her intentions and mental state. Linda called us crying the next morning because Sharon had called her from a burner phone. Sharon told her to pass a message that she was coming for me and Daniel no matter what. She said we took everything from her and she had nothing left to lose now. The FBI traced the call to a motel 50 miles away, but she was already gone when they got there. She'd paid cash and used a fake name, but the clerk recognized her from the news. Claire called me the next afternoon, completely freaking out because Sharon had been at her house. She said Sharon looked totally unhinged with dirty clothes and unwashed hair, talking about divine justice. Sharon had been asking where we were staying and wouldn't leave until Claire threatened to call the cops. The security footage from Claire's house showed Sharon had lost a lot of weight and looked sick. Her face was gaunt and her eyes looked wild, like she hadn't slept in days. By day 3 of the manhunt, the FBI decided we weren't safe and moved us to a safe house. Daniel couldn't go to work and I couldn't sleep even with agents protecting us. He sat staring at the news coverage saying Sharon had destroyed our family and our peace and our future. Even hiding like this, she was still winning and ruining our lives from wherever she was. Then Sharon showed up at Robert's apartment complex screaming for him to come out and face her. She was yelling that he was still her husband before God and he'd vowed for better or worse. Robert called 911 while she started breaking his window with a brick she'd found. When police sirens got close, she ran to a car nobody recognized and took off fast. The police chased her through downtown going 70 miles an hour running red lights. She was swerving between lanes, almost hitting other cars while police tried to stop her. The chase ended when she lost control and crashed hard into a highway barrier doing 60. She was hurt but still conscious when the EMTs got there and still ranting about betrayal. She screamed at the news cameras that this wasn't over and we'd destroyed an innocent woman. She called me evil incarnate while they loaded her into the ambulance with police guards. At the hospital, they handcuffed her to the bed in the secure ward while she got treated. She was facing new charges for assault and stalking and vandalism and evading arrest on top of everything else. Her public defender told her to plead guilty for a lighter sentence, but she refused completely. She kept saying she was the victim and the jury would see the truth about us. The doctor said she was completely detached from reality and needed psychiatric evaluation immediately. They ran blood tests and urine samples as part of the standard intake, and 3 days later the results came back showing something nobody expected. The doctor pulled Daniel and me aside in the hallway and showed us the toxicology report with methamphetamine levels that were off the charts. Sharon had been using meth for at least 6 months based on the hair follicle analysis they ran. The psychiatrist explained that she'd probably started using to stay awake longer at the casinos and then got hooked, and it made her paranoia and anger 100 times worse. The gambling addiction mixed with the meth created this perfect storm of crazy behavior that explained why she'd gone from mean comments to trying to destroy our lives. The prosecutor met with us that same afternoon and added attempted murder to the charges because of the knife in our door, plus all the death threats she'd made on the recordings. She said with Sharon's age and the amount of charges she was facing, at least 15 to 20 years, which basically meant she'd die in prison. Daniel just sat there staring at the wall, not saying anything while I held his hand. 2 weeks later, Sharon's trial started and she'd fired her public defender to represent herself, which the judge warned her against 3 times, but she insisted she knew better than any lawyer. Her opening statement was completely insane as she stood there in her orange jumpsuit rambling about how we'd all conspired against her, including Robert and the police and the FBI and even her own former lawyer who she claimed was working with us. The jury looked confused and shocked as she went on for 40 minutes about identity theft rings and government conspiracies and how we'd drugged her to make her look crazy. When my turn came to testify, I sat in that witness chair for 5 straight hours, going through every single thing she'd done from the first mean comment at our wedding to the knife in our door. Sharon kept interrupting and calling me terrible names until the judge threatened to hold her in contempt and remove her from the courtroom. Daniel watched from the gallery with tears running down his face as his mother showed everyone exactly who she really was. The next day, Daniel had to testify about finding the forged documents and the identity theft and discovering all the credit cards she'd opened in his name. Sharon completely lost it and started screaming at him about being ungrateful and how she gave him life and raised him, and this was how he repaid her. The bailiffs had to physically drag her out of the courtroom while she kept screaming, and the judge said she'd watch the rest of the trial on video from a holding cell. Robert's testimony was the hardest to watch as he talked about their 35 years of marriage and how he'd loved someone who never actually existed because she'd been lying and manipulating him the entire time. He said she'd been acting since the day they met, and he'd fallen for a character, not a real person. Sharon watched from her cell on the video monitor, and for once she didn't say anything, just stared at the screen. The jury came back after only 3 hours of deliberation, with guilty verdicts on every single count, including identity theft and fraud and grand theft and stalking and attempted murder and evading arrest. Sharon didn't react at all when they read the verdict, just stared straight ahead like she wasn't even there anymore. Daniel squeezed my hand so hard it hurt and whispered that it was finally over. 2 months later at sentencing, Sharon gave this speech about being a sick woman who needed help, not prison, but the judge cut her off and said she'd had countless chances to get help but chose crime instead. He sentenced her to 22 years, which meant she'd never get out alive given her age and health problems. As the guards led her away in shackles, she looked right at us and said she forgave us with this creepy smile and that when she was gone, we'd realize what we'd lost. Daniel spoke for the first time in months and told her we'd lost her years ago, and this was just the funeral. A week after sentencing, we met with Patricia, our lawyer, to talk about going after Sharon civilly for damages, but she explained there was nothing left to get since Sharon had spent everything on gambling and lawyers. We decided to let it go because we wanted to move forward with our lives, not stay stuck in the past, fighting over money that didn't exist. 3 weeks later, Daniel and I sat in the therapist's waiting room holding hands so tight my fingers went numb. The therapist called us in, and we spent the first 20 minutes just sitting there not knowing where to start. She told us we needed to rebuild from scratch since our whole marriage had been under attack. We started going every Tuesday, and slowly things got easier between us. Robert started coming to our house for dinner every Thursday night, and one evening he mentioned he'd met someone at his support group. Daniel actually smiled for real when Robert said she understood what he'd been through. The church community reached out more than ever, and Pastor asked if I'd speak at a service about surviving manipulation. I agreed because maybe our story could help someone else recognize the same patterns. A month later, we got a letter from Sharon in prison, but Daniel burned it without opening it. He said that chapter was closed, and we planted tomatoes in the backyard where the dead grass used to be. 6 months passed, and life found its rhythm again with Daniel getting promoted at work. I started volunteering with a support group for families of addicts every Saturday morning. Claire and I met for coffee like we used to, and she noticed I was different somehow. She said I seemed stronger, but also softer, and I knew she was right. Linda called one afternoon with news that Sharon had been diagnosed with liver failure from all the drinking. The doctors gave her maybe 2 years, and Daniel just nodded when I told him. He said he'd already mourned his mother, and this didn't change anything for him. We sent a card to the prison chaplain asking them to give her spiritual support. Robert sold the old house and moved in with his girlfriend Sarah, who made him laugh like I'd never seen. He told us he woke up without dread for the first time in decades. He was working part-time at the hardware store and rebuilding his finances slowly. Daniel and I went to see the old house before the new owners moved in. The rose garden Sharon used to tend was completely overgrown with weeds everywhere. Daniel stood there looking at the mess and said she'd taught him something valuable. He said he knew how not to live and how not to treat people. He'd be better by being nothing like her, and we left without looking back. The Christmas came and we hosted dinner at our house for the first time ever. Robert brought Sarah, and Claire came with her whole family filling our dining room. Linda stopped by with pie, and even Pastor dropped in for dessert. I watched Daniel laughing with his dad while Sarah told stories about their trip to the lake. The doorbell kept ringing with more friends arriving with food and presents. Looking around at all these people who chose to be our family, I realized something. Sharon was wrong about me destroying her family because I didn't destroy anything. I helped build something better from the pieces she left behind. This was what family really meant, and it had nothing to do with blood.